we, in our fallenness, we want to hold on to things and be in control of things. And this is why we like the measurements of science so much. But the life of faith, as you say, gets us out of ourselves and gets us to trust in God. And that's where Percy wants us to go. It's a scary place to go, though, because we're not in control.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Welcome to The Literary Catholic. I'm Rafael Pi Roman. Walker Percy was one of the most popular and most critically acclaimed Catholic novelists of the second half of the 20th century. And 35 years after his death, all of his novels are still in print and still selling briskly. Joining us today to talk about Walker Percy's life and work is Father Damian Ference. Father Damian is a priest of the Diocese of Cleveland, where he serves as Vicar for Evangelization and professor at Borromeo Seminary. Father Damian received his doctorate in philosophy from the Pontificate University in Rome. He writes about faith and culture and is the author of the wonderful award-winning book on Flannery O'Connor called The Hillbilly Thomist. Father Damian, welcome.
Thank you, Raphael. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you. Now, first of all, Father Damian, let's start at the beginning. Who was Walker Percy? Could you give us a very quick summary of his life and work?
I can. Walker Percy was born May 28th, 1916. He was not born as a Catholic, but in 1946 married a young woman who he met when he was in medical school, and then the very next year entered the Catholic Church, became in full communion with the Catholic Church. He started off wanting to study medicine and thinking that science could answer most of life's important questions, but as he moved through his own life, particularly his own sickness, he realized that there was more to life than simply the truths of science, and he became very interested in the soul and philosophy. And so he wrote the award-winning novel, The Moviegoer. I'm sure we'll talk about some of his other works too. Back in 2015 or 2016, I made a literary pilgrimage. I was visiting a friend down in New Orleans, Cross-Lake Pontchartrain, and he died May 10th, 1990. He was 73 years old and is buried now at the Abbey up there, St. Joseph's Abbey in Covington. So he's, as you mentioned in your introduction, still matters today. And the further we get away from his death, the more important his fiction seems to become. Yeah. So certainly worthy of our conversation today.
Right. And we'll talk about all that. But, when asked in interviews about the most decisive moments of his life, Percy usually included these three, which include some of what you've said. Number one, losing both parents in his early teens, his father by suicide, and his mother in a car accident, which a lot of people think was also a suicide, among them Walker Percy himself. Two, contracting a non-fatal case of tuberculosis while serving as an intern in Bellevue Hospital back in 1941 in New York. And three, becoming a Catholic. So let's touch on all these three. Let's talk about all these three. And let's start off with his traumatic loss of his parents. How traumatic was that loss of having lost his parents so young and in the way that he lost them? And how is that trauma or that impact manifested in his work?
Yeah, a few years ago, I wrote a piece for Word on Fire on Walker Percy. This is how I opened my essay. If anyone should have killed himself, it should have been Walker Percy. After all, suicide ran in his family and it went back generations. One Percy overdosed on morphine, another jumped into a creek with a sugar kettle tied around his neck. Even Percy's grandfather took his life, and when he was only 13 years old, his own father shot himself dead in the attic of the family home. And then, as you mentioned, his mother had a car accident, but many suggest that it was probably suicide that took her too. So imagine this being part of your family, this suicidal ideation. The fact that he died of prostate cancer and not suicide is remarkable and probably a small miracle.
And by the way, he says that one of his greatest accomplishment, at one point he said one of his greatest accomplishment was being the oldest living Percy.
Percy. Yeah. And it's incredible. And it reminds us that life is difficult. We live in a fallen world, and a lot of our responsibility is simply fighting for life. And that's what he did from an early age. So it's so important to have models in our life that can show us the way. And fortunately, he had his uncle Will, who was a major influence in his life, but that his own parents left him that example was certainly a cross to bear and one to overcome.
Yeah. And in, I think all of his books, suicide plays a role. Perhaps not in Lancelot, but that's the one where multiple murders are involved. So maybe that's a substitute for that.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the second event that he believes is one of the most important in his life. On his contracting tuberculosis while an intern at Bellevue Hospital in 1941 before antibiotics, Percy has said that it didn't so much change his life, that experience, as, quote, give him leave to change it. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, so he writes this about that time. He says, I was in bed so much, alone so much. I had nothing to do but read and think. I began to question everything I had once believed. And then I say, Percy's sickness forced him to question the meaning of suffering and the meaning of life and of his own existence. And these are questions that science can't answer. Yeah. Science can help us when we're suffering, to relieve us from suffering, but it cannot answer the question of why we suffer. And can we draw meaning from suffering? Those are philosophical, theological questions that need to be answered with philosophy and theology, not science. Not that science is bad, it's just ill-equipped to answer certain questions, philosophical and theological ones.
And not only changed his thought or his way of thinking, it changed his trajectory. He decided at that time that he didn't want to be a doctor, that instead he wanted to be a writer, and he wanted to write about the things that you just mentioned, right?
Correct, yeah, human suffering. And he started reading philosophy, and he was reading Dostoevsky, and he was reading Sartre, and he was reading Kierkegaard. And it's interesting that when people get sick, oftentimes that's a way into a depth of reality. I'm thinking of Ignatius of Loyola when he got shot in the leg by the cannonball. It was during that experience of his life that transformed him. So sometimes the greatest sufferings, the greatest hardships in our life become the greatest blessings and conduits to a new way of living.
And what led him to his conversion to Catholicism? I guess this was the beginning of it, his reading of these people and his beginning to change his view on science and reality. But beyond that, what made him specifically choose Catholicism?
Yeah, his uncle Will was influential in him, but he cites that he had a college roommate, or in medical school rather, who would get up and go to mass every morning, like quietly, the example of that. And then his wife, Bunt, I think what was her name? Bernice, Mary Bernice, but she went as Bunt. Mary Bernice Townsend was also a Catholic, and eventually that won him over too.
Okay. Now, Percy's first writings were philosophical essays published largely in small scholarly journals, but he turned to fiction after having been inspired by a handful of French fiction writers, among them Sartre, Camus, and Marcel. And these were writers who were doing something that American writers were not, and that was incorporating their philosophical ideas and concerns into their novels and plays. What were the philosophical ideas and concerns that Percy wanted to incorporate in fiction?
Yeah, this is excellent, because he winds up doing just that. He winds up trying to do what especially the French philosophers were doing, to novelize philosophy. And so the big questions were, what does it mean to be human? Who are we? Where are we heading? He's writing post-World War II. So we just suffered 2 terrible wars. People thought the world was going to come to an end, and things that we thought would give meaning and save us didn't. And he's trying to find our place in that world, especially in a post-rational world where we used to trust that the most intelligent societies would be the ones that would save us. And he argues, and we'll get to this in a little bit, that actually what we thought would bring us our greatest salvation in some ways brought us our greatest downfall. So he wants to get back to the perennial questions of who we are and where we're heading, and then also address the false gods and the false prophets that got us into some of the trouble that we made our way into. So can I mention now that one of my, although I love his writing, in 1989, I believe, Percy received the Laetare Medal from the University of Notre Dame. And this goes right along with your question. So he says this, he says, while truth should prevail, it is a disaster when only one kind of truth prevails at the expense of another. If only one kind of truth prevails, the abstract and technical truth of science, then nothing stands in the way of a demeaning of and a destruction of human life for what appear to be short-term goals. It's no accident, I think, that German science, great as it was, ended in the destruction of the Holocaust. So you ask what his philosophical ideas were that he was trying to embed in his fiction. I think it's that science is good and will get you so far, but you're not going to solve the deepest problems of humanity with scientific answers.
Yeah, I'm going to bring that very idea of Percy later on in this conversation because he brings it up in a bunch of different venues, including in his writings, and I think it's critical. But anyway, by his own account, Percy's chief philosophical influence was the 19th century Danish Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
Now, how exactly did the philosophy of this Protestant curmudgeon, so-called scourge of Christendom influence or inform Percy's deep Catholic faith?
Well, it's a great question. And I teach a 19th and 20th century continental philosophy course to our seminarians. And when I do, I remind them of in Copenhagen, where Kierkegaard was living, it was a very comfortable kind of Christianity. And he thought that people were, because Christianity became such a part of the culture, they weren't taking the demands of Christianity seriously enough. And so he comes up, roughly speaking, with three basic types of people. He talks about the aesthetic, he talks about the ethicist, and then he talks about the one who's living the religious life. And even in our pre-conversations to this recording, you've had an observation of how you understood those three characters. Do you want to share that? Because I thought that was helpful.
Yeah, I have long heard about those three forms of living that Kierkegaard proposed. I didn't quite understand it because I was thrown by the aesthetic. I thought that was like cultural living, but no, by that he means like hedonistic living, self-regarding living. I understand that. One way of dividing it is hedonism, Stoicism, and Christianity, and another way, and I think this is what Percy was always thinking about, is a movement away from the self. In the hedonistic or the aesthetic sphere, like what you care is about beauty, yes, but also comfort, about happiness, about yourself, everything about yourself. Yep. Not having a headache, not having a toothache, that kind of thing. In the ethical, you see that you remove yourself from yourself a little bit and begin to care about, the big ethical issues. In the religious sphere, you've abandoned yourself, and yourself really becomes actually the self to the transparency of God. That's how I interpret it, largely from Percy.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I think like the aesthetic is one who is concerned with pleasure and having a good time. I even think if you've seen the movie Scorsese's Wolf of Wall Street, it's kind of like that, but it leaves you empty. And then the ethical seems to be a better way of going because you're more concerned with the universal good and avoiding evil. But as you say, there still tends to be a focus on the self, and you're the one in control of your life. And this leap of faith, the religious life, he wrote a whole book on it. It's The Fear and Trembling. It's basically the story of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham being called to sacrifice his only son Isaac, and all that he's going through and thinking about in these 3 days leading up to the sacrificial offering of his beloved son, what mattered most. And he holds this guy up as a knight of faith because in one sense, it doesn't make any sense to do this because this is only beloved son, but he's going to jump, he's going to leap, he's going to get outside himself and trust himself completely to God. And in doing so, he finds everything that he ever wanted. And that seems counterintuitive because in our fallenness, we want to hold on to things and be in control of things. And this is why we like the measurements of science so much. But the life of faith, as you say, gets us out of ourselves and gets us to trust in God. And that's where Percy wants us to go. It's a scary place to go, though, because we're not in control.
Right. Now, another Kierkegaardian concept that Percy talked about again and again in his nonfiction, and that you see it explicitly in his fiction talked about as well, is human beings as wayfarers in a journey rather than as organisms in an environment. Talk about that. What did that exactly mean?
Yeah, again, writing post-World War II, man is trying to figure out who the heck he is and where the heck he's going. So like one of the books one of my colleagues uses in our human person course is Lost in the Cosmos, which is a good way to describe man as a wayfarer. So where are we heading? What are we doing? We've got all these, the highway system that was built in the United States, the interstate system. We can get anywhere we want to go. We can travel, but where are we actually heading and what are we looking for? And even, the protagonist of the moviegoer, Binks Bowling, like, I'm going to movies at night, but what is it that I really want? What is it I'm searching for? Do I even know this? And this is the question he's asking over and over again, it seems to me.
One of the principles, one of the biggest preoccupations that Percy had throughout most of his writing career was what he felt was a devaluing or neutering of language, of words, especially the words associated with religion. That's a subject that he kept going back to again and again. Now, he put those concerns into his final novel, the Thanatos Syndrome, where his character, the prophet-like Catholic priest Rinaldo Smith, says this, quote, "If the existence of God, heaven, hell, and sin were all proved as certainly as the distance to the sun is proved, it would make no difference to unbelievers and so-called believers, because the words have been deprived of their meaning." First of all, what does Percy think caused this deprivation of meaning in words?
Well, I'm looking at Signposts in a Strange Land, which is a collection of his essays here. And there's a whole section called Science, Language, and Literature. And he loves this philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce. And the attention to language and what language does and what it points to or what it doesn't point to, and how language can be manipulated in a particular way to maybe fool us to think that there is no real world out there and that words simply are used to fool us or trick us. And he's trying to tease out the meaning and understand what words do and how signs work and how language works. So we could do a whole show on just that, but he has a lot to say about that sort of thing.
In fact, it's funny when I was reading about this in his nonfiction, it reminded me Flannery O'Connor, the subject of your book, the Hillbilly Thomist, also was concerned about the devaluation of language, that it was losing its meaning. She also had concerns that you could no longer convey religious ideas or ideas of faith through ordinary language, and she used exaggerations. Her famous line, you'll quote it perfectly, but I'll just say what I think it is, for the hard of hearing you scream, for those who have difficulty seeing you draw startling
large startling figures.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was her method of getting around the problem with ordinary language being insufficient. Percy attempted to get around the problem through what he called indirection, a method he borrowed from Kierkegaard. What is the method of indirection that Percy tried to use to get around this problem with words?
You know it better than I do. When we had a conversation yesterday, I liked your summary better than I could, and I could play off what you say, though.
Okay, yeah, I did look around. I did research it. What does that mean? What was Kierkegaard's? And there's a bunch of different definitions for it, some of it that overlap and some don't. But let me just read it to you what I found. Indirection is making it difficult for readers to know your own point of view by presenting multiple contradictory points of view. It means never edifying and never preaching. It means using words out of their usual context. It means using silence to convey the most important ideas. And it means asking rather than in a question, means asking it rather than answering it. And you see so many of these things actually work out in Walker Percy's work. Can you think of examples of that, of any of that working out of his work?
Well, I know this is not your favorite book, but again, like Lost in the Cosmos is a funny book, and it's a mock self-help book designed not to help but to provoke. That's how it's summarized. So he's not, as O'Connor would say, he's not telling, he's showing, and he's trying to get the reader to think outside the box in such a way where he'll offer some twists and he'll offer some turns and humor and wrinkles that will need to, or knots that need to be untied. And in untying of these knots, he gets the reader to think about something that maybe hasn't been considered before, particularly that certain questions are answered not just by science and we're not just materialists, that there's something beyond. For instance, in Love in the Ruins, he's very interested in the soul, and he has a machine. I had to look it up because I forgot about it. But this machine is supposed to somehow measure something that is invisible, right? Something that is not material, but is immaterial. It's called Moore's qualitative, quantitative, ontological lapsometer. That's funny. Like, how can you have a machine that could do that sort of thing? Yet we do think, like I'm thinking of Elon Musk now, and people thinking that somehow we can draw out our consciousness and take our brains and that our brains are somehow the same thing as our souls, which they're not, and then freeze them somehow or insert them in another being, like all these sorts of questions. He'll play with that, both as one who's trained in science, but as a philosopher, and just trying to open up the question to get us thinking more deeply about reality.
So he put that to good use. But nevertheless, some critics say that Percy's indirect method was too indirect sometimes, at least in his early works. For example, he has said in interviews that the resolution of his first novel, The Moviegoer, is the conversion of its protagonist, Binks Bowling, from a nominal Catholic to a believing Catholic, and that fact is made evident in one short sentence that he has near the end of his book with his very young stepkids. Now, when I read that, when I read the interview, when I read Percy's explanation of it, I saw it. I said, yes, of course, that's it. But I didn't see it when I read the book, and my wife read the book and she didn't see it.
Yeah.
So do you think that perhaps he was indeed a little too subtle in his indirection sometimes?
I don't know, because I think good literature does that sort of thing to you. The first time I'm an expert on Flannery O'Connor, as I told you, not Walker Percy, but I like Walker Percy. I've read most of his stuff. But the first time reading through something, you may simply just appreciate the dialogue or some of the symbolism, but you may not get all the meaning. And it's similar to praying and reading with scripture. Like the deeper you make your way into a text, the more you can say, oh, I've read this a million times, but I finally saw this. I think of O'Connor's first novel, Wise Blood, where at the end of the story, Hazel Motes blinds himself. And some people say that was the most horrific thing that he could have done. But from O'Connor's point of view, that was his salvation. Mm-hmm. And he was actually entering more deeply into the contemplative life. But a lot of people, even some very well-educated critics, missed it. And so it doesn't surprise me that some folks may miss some of what Percy's up to in his fiction as well. That happens.
But, as I was preparing for this interview and reading Kierkegaard and reading about Kierkegaard, I read for the first time that Kierkegaard himself came to dislike the method of indirection and actually abandoned it before he wrote a number of books without it. Mm-hmm. And I think I personally think, for whatever that's worth, that Percy did as well in his final two novels. For example, this is what his protagonist, Will Barrett, says in the final paragraph of Percy's penultimate novel, The Second Coming. Quote, "What is it I want from her, the woman he's about to marry? And him, God? Is she a gift and therefore a sign of the giver? Could it be that the Lord is here masquerading behind the simple, silly, holy face? Am I crazy to want both her and him? No, not want, must have and will have." And in the Thanatos syndrome, this is what Father Smith says, among other things, in his famous sermon to a chapel full of, quote, "tender-hearted, unbelieving, philanthropic people."
Mm-hmm.
Listen to me, dear physicians, dear brothers, abortionists, euthanicists. Well, I don't know how to pronounce it. Euthanicists, I think that's the way it is. Never in the history of the world have there been so many civilized souls, and never in the history of the world have so many people been killed. More people have been killed in this century by tender-hearted souls than by cruel barbarians in all the other centuries put together. My brothers, let me tell you where the tenderness leads, to the gas chamber. This is kind of like what you were making reference to earlier. Now, in those two quotes, I think they're real. I think it demonstrates real Catholicism straight up, right?
Yes.
And that if that's not direct, I don't know what is.
Well,
Go ahead.
that line that you just read
Yeah.
comes from Flannery O'Connor's introduction to Mary Ann. And she has this line in there. She says, if other ages felt less, they saw more, even though they saw with the blind, prophetical, unsentimental eye of acceptance, which is to say of faith. In the absence of this faith now, we govern by tenderness. This is where it sounds familiar. It is a tenderness which, long since cut off from the person of Christ, is wrapped in theory. And here it is. When tenderness is detached from the source of tenderness, its logical outcome is terror. It ends in forced labor camps and in the fumes of the gas chamber.
Wow.
Percy got that from her in this particular essay. But that he starts putting that in his fiction later on is interesting, because perhaps O'Connor would have if she lived long enough, but she died at 39. He died at, 73?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something like this. When you're younger, maybe you're not as explicit about what you think until you get older. But sometimes people will say when people get older, they can say whatever they want because they've
Yeah.
earned their stripes. And I wonder if that's true of a novelist too. Like, okay, you've gotten this thing down enough. Now you can be a bit more explicit in what you want to do. I wonder if that's part of what Percy was up to. And I wonder if O'Connor would have done the same had she lived long enough.
Yeah, maybe. But I'd like to think that he just decided to let his freak fly there at the
Could have
end.
been. Yeah, that could have been. Yeah.
Anyway, Percy said, talking about his two apocalyptic or semi-apocalyptic novels, The Love in the Ruins and The Thanatos Syndrome, that he didn't mean to prophesy in them that the catastrophe or that the catastrophe depicted in them would happen. He didn't mean to prophesy that they would happen, but what he wanted to do was warn readers so that it wouldn't happen.
Right.
But a recent critic wrote that since versions of what he depicts in those novels have come to pass, such as, quote, the aggravation of racial divisions, the further division of all people by their various identities, the manipulation of scientific data by the so-called experts, even as they admonish us to trust the science, and the expansion of the culture of death in the name of compassion, maybe Percy was better at prophesying than at warning. What do you think?
Well, I think a prophet is one who speaks for God and is not necessarily predicting the future, but is trying to call people back to God and then warning, if you don't heed this call, then this is going to happen. So I think it's a both and kind of thing. I think he did both. He spoke warnings, but was also trying to let people, like, give them time to come back. But yeah, I read Love in the Ruins most recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember saying, geez, he had prophetic vision, as O'Connor would call it here. It's pretty great. Yeah.
Now, Father, you from our conversation so far, somebody might not familiar with Percy might think that his work is generally dark and pessimistic. Are they?
Well, do you think a crucifix is dark and pessimistic? I suppose it depends who's looking at it and what you know. So some people may come into a Catholic church and look around and say, "Oh, why do you have an image of a dying man on a cross? That's gruesome. I don't want to look at that. Give me a butterfly instead, or something that makes me happy." However, if you believe what Percy believed, that God took on human flesh, born of the Virgin, and then rather than coming to condemn humanity, he allowed himself to be condemned, poured himself out on the cross, then you see the crucifix as an act of love. It is still dark, it is still scary, and it is still death, but it is also God overcoming death. So again, it's one of these both and kind of things. O'Connor did that with the grotesque. Good fiction and good art will do that. Like, think of Caravaggio's paintings. They're not just dark and they're not just light, but what makes his paintings great is that you've got this wonderful contrast of darkness and light. And I think that's what you find in Percy's work, that he'll get your attention, especially in a post-World War II era, by not drawing rainbows and butterflies, but by giving us a real look at things, a real open-eyed look at reality, and then speaking into it with his Christian faith.
Yeah.
And again, let's go back to the beginning of this conversation. All those suicides that his family experienced, and he's navigating his way through that. He's not forgotten that or saying that's not part of my reality or not part of my possibility. He's constantly thinking about that and being haunted by it and having to navigate his way through that as a man in the modern world, which is difficult but possible.
Yeah. Now let's talk about Percy and race. As you know, even during her lifetime, Flannery O'Connor was criticized, or at least admonished, for her use of the N-word in her fiction, and recently the criticism seems to have reemerged for some reason. For example, a recent edition of one of her collection of short stories has a new introduction by a writer who seems eager to castigate O'Connor for the use of the N-word in her stories and novels, completely dismissing the reason O'Connor always gave for such use, namely that the people she wrote about talk that way. Percy also uses the N-word at least as much as O'Connor did, but hard as I've tried to find any criticism of him for that, I have not yet found it. Now, maybe I've just missed it, and you tell me if I have, but if I have not missed it and there hasn't been criticism of him for that, why has he been spared?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have not read any major criticism of Walker Percy for this, what I would call the sin of racism. I think it's twofold. One, O'Connor died August 3rd, 1964. And so this is right when the civil rights movement was on its way. And she was working out her understanding of race in her own mind, in her own heart, in letter writing, but most particularly in her fiction. But she was not able to see the civil rights movement. She was not able to see when was Martin Luther King killed? 68? Yes, Kennedy was killed in 63. Yeah, 68. MLK and Robert Kennedy in 68. So she didn't live that far. And so we don't know what her more mature thought would have been. She was 39 when she died. Percy was able to see through that and get through that. I also think it is a little easier to pick on Flannery O'Connor because we don't have as many. I mean, she has 32 short stories. She has 2 novels. We have some of her ideas of essay, but it's still, in terms of the whole understanding of race, it's a bit underdeveloped because she died too soon. Percy was able to address these things and see how some of these things played out. But even him, in one of his essays here, he says that the ultimate basis for racial reconciliation must be theological rather than legal and sociological, and that in the South, perhaps in more than any other region, the civil and secular consciousness is still sufficiently informed by a theological tradition to provide a sanction for racial reconciliation. So I think he was hopeful in this. And I think in some ways, because he was friends with O'Connor, we may see what O'Connor's thought may have looked like in Percy's thought. But it is unfortunate. I was at the Catholic Imagination Conference at the University of Notre Dame back in November, and the O'Connor panel said how unfortunate it was that Paul Elie dropped that essay in the New Yorker magazine, and it was entitled like, "How Racist Was O'Connor?" So how do you answer that question? Yeah. And it was maybe a week or two after the George Floyd riot. So it was like the worst timing for this. And I address it in a footnote in my book, but I think I think it's a bit unfair. I think it's a bit unfair. And I think also when we talk about racism, we need to talk about it as a sin, like other sins, and that just as we would be patient as people work through their sin, so too, if racism is a sin, then give some people time to work through it and allow healing to take place, because it can and it will. But I don't know why people pick on O'Connor more than Percy. She's certainly a better known author than Walker Percy is, but that's my best guess.
I can't. I was thinking about this, reflecting on this, and one answer that I came up with is because, unlike O'Connor and unlike most of his contemporary Southern writers of the late 20th century, Percy was unusual in that he was very willing to be vocal about his condemnation of racism and about his support for civil rights. I remember, Eudora Welty was a friend of his, but he criticized her publicly because she said, there's a crusader and there's a writer. You can't put them together. And he says, of course you can put them together. Mm. Put them together, especially if you're one of us from down here. Mm-hmm. And as far as time making him more wise because he lived further on to experience the civil rights movement, as we spoke about yesterday, in 1965 he wrote an essay, basically condemning white Southern Christians for not being at the vanguard of the civil rights struggle, because he said, that was a calamity, but not unremarkable, given the historic collaboration of white Christian Southerners with the oppression of African Americans. So maybe people have given him a pass because he was so obviously, he also got a lot of negativity from his friends and neighbors because of those stands.
Yeah, and also, too, the 60s, talk about the times were changing. Even if O'Connor had a couple more years to live, maybe they would have written more about this. I don't know. But I, as we mentioned in our pre-conversation yesterday, in many ways, Percy was ahead of the curve in terms of, like, he was, even though the council had just closed, I think he and O'Connor were so intelligent and I think prayerful that they were kind of anticipating a lot of what the Second Vatican Council would call the church to, in reminding of us of who we were to be out in the modern world. And the race relations included in that.
Now, in 1988, on the 15th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, Percy sent a letter to the New York Times basically making the same argument that Father Smith had made in his sermon in the Santa Claus Syndrome that I quoted, that the most effective voice justifying the taking of human life for supposedly more admirable social reasons in the early decades of the 20th century in Germany were not those of Nazis, but of respected jurists and doctors of the democratic Weimar Republic, and that it was hardly necessary to say what the Nazis made of those ideas. The Times refused to publish that piece. Yeah. They refused to publish a piece from somebody who at that time was one of the most respected, well-known authors in America. Mm-hmm. Sitting reading that, it reminded me of what happened to Daniel Berrigan, Father Daniel Berrigan, who was, of course, lionized for his courageous fight against the Vietnam War. He went to jail for it by progressives, yet he was pilloried by some of those very same progressives when he prayed outside an abortion clinic. Right. And it makes me wonder, where do serious, faithful Catholics, where do they belong in the American political spectrum?
Yeah, I like to say we're political orphans. And if you've never heard of it, there's a party called the American Solidarity Party, which I think exists for this reason. And I would be interested to know if what Percy would think about it today, because yeah, it's hard to find a place where you can find a consistent ethic of life in either one of our two political parties today. And that leaves the Catholic like scratching his head. And certainly people argue, well, you go here because it's more like this, or you go there. Um, I don't know. From the moment of conception until natural death, and that includes everyone in between, from the poor and the marginalized and the immigrant and the migrant and those on deathbed and those on death row and in the womb, all that, like all life matters, and we protect it at all costs. There's a Jesuit priest in my diocese. He's a good friend of mine, and he's been arrested both for protesting at abortion clinics will protest that, and then the air show. And he because it's an excessive, he calls it an excessive display of military might. So where do you put this guy? Well, I mean, he's a Catholic, and that's kind of how they look sometimes. And so, I think Catholics ought to appear strange. And anytime we get too embedded into our American culture, we better check ourselves, because it's a sign that 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 something has taken precedence over our identity as beloved sons and daughters of the Father in this kingdom we call the kingdom of God, which is definitely very weird
Mhm.
in a good way.
Yeah. So, Father, let's talk a little bit about Walker Percy's effect on you personally. When did you first discover his work, and what effect did it have on the way you see the world and the way you see the faith?
Yeah. So I want to say it was, I heard of Walker Percy, but I wasn't until maybe my senior year of college or my first year of seminary in theology that I read an article by Will Percy, who's Walker Percy's nephew, in a magazine called Double Take, and he interviewed Bruce Springsteen.
Hmm.
And I think Walker Percy had written Springsteen, and Springsteen never got back to him, and they talked a little bit about that. And of course, Springsteen's favorite author was Flannery O'Connor. So anyone, and I love Springsteen, so I was just really getting into fiction and reading Southern authors, and I got into Percy in that way. What do I take from him? I like his prose as much as I like his fiction, if not more. I think if someone would push me, I would say my favorite book is Signposts in a Strange Land, because I love the essays. I love the philosophical nature of them. And I love how he's constantly playing with the culture and trying to find himself as a Catholic in and using his prophetic voice. I also love his story of conversion. I love that he was kind of haunted by the suicides in his own family. I like that he, by the quiet witness of a roommate, became Catholic. I like that his Catholicism mattered to him very much. And I so love that he received that highest award at Notre Dame. And although the New York Times may not have published his letter, he was able to speak very vocally and strongly about his beliefs there in a way that was still authentic and cool and not proselytizing, but just brave and courageous and intelligent. All those things matter to me. And I want to be that kind of priest too, where I'm good at what I'm doing and confident in what I'm doing, and kind of letting my life hopefully speak of God, not because I'm perfect, but hopefully because I'm faithful, even in my weakness.
As I said in the introduction, as we spoke, all of Percy's books, I think even all his nonfiction books, are still in print and still selling well, 35 years after his death. And as the Catholic writer Jessica Houghton Wilson put it, why does his work continue to matter so much to so many? I hear what you're saying, but most people are not Catholic priests or even
Right.
Catholics,
Yeah.
who read his books.
Yeah. I think a big part of it is what he intuited in himself. And that is, we live in a world that likes to measure things, and we're caught up in our material selves. And all of us get to a point at some time in our life where we realize there's a lot more to life than that. And we get into the deeper questions, the bigger questions about love, about the soul, about the meaning of life, about where I'm heading and what I'm doing. And he gets there too in his fiction, even if he's doing it in a snarky, a little bit of a backhanded way, as you'd say before, like this crazy machine that's supposed to measure the soul. So I think he gets us back to the perennial questions, but not as a 13th century person or as a 17th century, but as a 20th century or 21st century person. Like, he's dealing with the questions of modernity. So post-Enlightenment, post-World War II, he's asking the right questions and writing about them in a way that's convincing.
So this final question, what would you advise to those who have not yet read Percy but want to begin to read it? Where should they start?
I think it depends on the person. I mean, his most well-known book is probably The Moviegoer, so you could start there. In terms of his fiction, my favorite is Love in the Ruins.
Yeah, mine too.
I also think if you're a little quirky of a reader, then go with Lost in the Cosmos. And if you want something that's more like a devotional, even though it's not a devotional, but a collected the essays, I like Signposts in a Strange Land. And I also would advise this, that although you'll read alone, and it's good to put down your phone, read with a dictionary so you can improve your vocabulary, and a pen. Also, read with at least one other person. Like, ask someone else to read with you so that when you get done, you can discuss what you read. And there's an intersubjectivity that's necessary to really plumb the depths of good essays and good fiction. And I think it's also gets us outside of ourselves and reminds us that we're made for others. So it's good to read alone and it's good to read, but it's also really wonderful to discuss what you read with at least one other person.
Yeah. That's great advice. That's great advice. Well, Father, it really has been terrific talking to you. It's been wonderful. Thank you,
Rafael. It's been an honor. And thank you for inviting me on your show. Even though I'm not a Percy expert, I certainly like him. And you made me do some of my homework for this interview too.
Thanks, Father.
Peace.